Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part three as we look at events that help shape the New Testament. And so we left off with Israel, Judea, finding itself under the control of the Greeks, and that this control would last until 163 BCE/BC. But during this period of Greek control, the Jewish people they began to disperse around the Greco-Roman world. So you have what's known as a Jewish diaspora, where the Jewish people are not living solely in their native land, Israel, Judea. And, they're living in cities like Colossae, Corinth, Alexandria, Carthage, Athens, Rome, Galatia, etc. Well, during this Jewish diaspora, Jews who lived in Greek speaking areas would translate their scriptures into Greek from Hebrew, and additional books would be written during this time period as well, which led to the creation of what's known as the Septuagint, which is often abbreviated with the Roman numeral for 70. This took place in Alexandria about 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus, where 70 rabbis, the word Septuagint refers to 70, gathered in Alexandria and they translated the Jewish scriptures from Hebrew into Greek. Essentially, again, you had Jewish people living around the Greco Roman world, many of them no longer even speaking Hebrew or knowing how to read it, those that were, able to read. And so, rabbis, about 2 centuries before the birth of Jesus, gathered together in Alexandria and translated the Jewish scriptures from Hebrew into Greek, which became known as the Septuagint, which is often abbreviated by the Roman numeral for 70. And you have additional books written during this time period as well. You have the Maccabean books, which tell the story of Hanukkah. You have the book of Baruch, which is attributed to Jeremiah's scribe. You have the book of Wisdom, the book of Sirach, etc., etc. Well, moving forward, in the year 63 BCE or BC, the Roman Empire took control of Judea, Israel, under the leadership of Pompey the Great. The image on the screen depicts the Roman army led by Pompey the Great, going into the temple in Jerusalem. But Pompey the Great, he was one of the two major generals of the Roman Empire, the other one being Julius Caesar. And the story is that when Pompey, essentially with the Roman army, took control of Judea, of Israel, and he hears about, the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem, which is the area that only the high priest was allowed to enter. He's like, well, I want to go in there. I want to see what this is. So he marches into the temple with an army, and members of the temple clergy are trying to stop him, and he basically just pushes them out of his way. He enters into the Holy of Holies, and he looks around and he says, well, where is the God? What he was expecting to see would be an image of the Abrahamic God. And that's not something that you have within Judaism. Within Christianity, it's a little bit different. To say something regarding religious images, religious artwork, Judaism does have religious art, religious images. The whole thing regarding a condemnation of images wasn't meant to prohibit art, because you do have like images of Abraham and Moses, also images of the other patriarchs. You have images of angels, of cherubims. Um, at Temple Israel, which is the temple that's located within the Springfield area, there's a stained glass image of Jacob wrestling with the angel. But what you don't have within Judaism is an image of God. With Christianity, it's a little bit different because of the understanding how Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. So the theology here is that, God has a face, God has taken on a face. And I've seen images of the Holy Trinity where Father, Son, and Holy Spirit look exactly the same. And unless you know Christian iconography, you would not be able to tell, which one is which. But in any case, during the periods of Greek and Roman rule, Roman control, you have four religious slash political parties that would emerge within Judaism. And who exactly or what exactly would be these four religious slash political parties? Well, we'll get to them in a moment, but if you know a little bit something regarding the New Testament, these, at least three out of the four, will be religious slash political parties you have probably heard of. And just might as well mention, this was the world that Jesus would have been born into, as he was born, um, under the control of the Roman Empire. But look a little bit at these religious slash political parties, and I'll probably put the first two up because they would really be the two that would be different in terms of their religious views. But the first would be the Pharisees. The Pharisees, they recognized what is known as the oral Torah, a belief in the soul and the resurrection of the body. Politically speaking, they tried to work with the Romans. And then next, you have the Sadducees. Well, the Sadducees, they rejected the idea of the oral Torah. They rejected a belief in the soul, or at least an eternal soul, and they rejected a belief in the resurrection of the body. And politically, they were often in high positions of power within the Roman government. So, to comment on some of these issues, starting with the oral Torah, what exactly is that? I mean, obviously, I've talked about, the written Torah, which of course would be the first five books of the Bible, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and there are 613 commandments within the Torah slash law. The 10 are but 613, or 10 of the 613, and modern day Jews cannot follow all of the 613 commandments of the Torah. I'll probably reference something more about that later. But what exactly is the oral Torah? Well, the oral Torah is what God spoke to Moses, but was not put down into written form. It was carried on orally by the tongue. But it's looked upon that the oral Torah carries the same amount of weight as the written Torah. It's kind of very similar to what apostolic tradition is known as in Christianity. Um, The Sadducees, however, they rejected the idea of an oral Torah. Simply put, they didn't see enough evidence to support it. For them, there was just the written Torah. And regarding the soul, a lot of this, I would say, would come from a Greek influence. In this case, I'm thinking of Plato versus Aristotle. One of the things in philosophy is what is known as the mind body problem. To give an example of that, in my introduction to philosophy class, there's a question that I asked that relates to the mind body problem. Let's say that I am giving a lecture, and during the lecture, I somehow cut myself, but I don't recognize the cut, and I just continue to lecture on. But my students, my audience, they do recognize the cut, and they recognize the blood coming from the cut. So I continue to lecture on without any issues, but I notice how my audience, my students, that there's something, not right about them. There's a look they're giving off that tells me that there's an issue. And I finally stop my lecture and I'm like, is there a problem? Is something wrong? And finally, one of them, gestures to my cut finger. And I look at my cut finger and I see the blood. And when I see the blood, I freak out. Okay, why though did it take me seeing the blood to freak out? Wouldn't I have noticed immediately when the cut happened? Well, that's an example of the mind body problem. Plato held that the mind and the body are separate. They're two separate issues. And that when the body dies, the mind, or what in this case we could call the soul, would live on. It would continue on. Aristotle, his student, Plato's student, while he understood his master, his teacher's logic in this, he just didn't see enough evidence to support it, enough empirical evidence to support it. But you could bring up to Aristotle the situation I gave. Well, why did it take me seeing the cut, the blood, to freak out? Why didn't it happen immediately? Well, Aristotle was willing to concede the idea of a soul and was willing to concede the notion of that soul or mind, in this case, we could say being separate from the body. But he held that when the body went, that the soul went with it. He just didn't see enough evidence for it to carry on. And that would also arguably be, the whole notion of, the resurrection of the body, in this case, the Pharisees holding to it and the Sadducees rejecting the idea. Now, on the political side here, the Pharisees, they tried to work with the Romans. They weren't, say, sycophants to the Romans, yes men, kiss ups, whatever term you want to use. But, they tried to take a moderate stance, tried to work with them. Whereas the Sadducees, they were more, you know, willing to kiss up with the Romans, willing to accept the Romans are the ones in charge. And because of that, they were often rewarded with high positions of power in the Roman government. So look now at the two other religious/political parties. You have the Essenes. Religiously, the Essenes, they held the same views as the Pharisees, but they chose not to get involved with politics. So the Essenes, religious wise, they held the same views as the Pharisees, but they chose not to get involved with politics. They were kind of a monastic form of Judaism. They were often outside Jerusalem and outside, major cities, you could say. They chose to stay away from the politics in the area. Like I said, they were essentially kind of a form of Jewish monasticism. And the next group, the Zealots, religiously, the Zealots, they had the same views as the Pharisees, but they were known for their violent behavior toward Roman soldiers. So again, with the Zealots, same religious views as the Pharisees, but they were known for their violent behavior towards the Romans. In the Passion narrative with Jesus, the prisoner exchange, the other prisoner that's known as Barabbas, who is accused of inciting an insurrection, more than likely he would have been a zealot. Well, we're going to need to stop here for the moment.